Love podcast, hate nonsense.
Woo!
I never do the end. I don't know why I never do the end.
What's the end?
Does Ollie do It's the Podcast? Or no?
Oh, yeah, it's the PoliticsJOE podcast.
Does he do that?
Sometimes.
I can't remember. I feel like that's one of those like Mandela effect things.
Yeah. I've heard it so much, it's become meaningless to me now.
Yeah, and who's even listening? Do you know what I mean? Okay, we're doing a proper podcast today.
On Scunthorpe.
Yeah.
Part 2.
We're doing a real one. Mm-hmm. We kind of did touch a little bit on it yesterday.
Definitely. And then it got very sidetracked.
I don't know why that happened.
It was good though. I enjoyed listening to it.
Don't lie. We left and you were like, what is that? Okay, should we just start? Do you want to tell me a little bit about where we are? Do we know if it's going to be nationalised?
Not yet, but Lisa Nandy was on the morning round yesterday morning, and she was being pushed by, like, will you nationalise it then? And she just kept saying, of course we won't rule out other options. We won't rule out all the options. What we want is a commercial solution with Jingye, but she kept repeating that all options are on the table and we won't rule it out. And Starmer said the same thing at the liaison committee on Monday. He kept saying that all options are on the table.
You see, it's odd to me that I always find the practice of like the culture secretary being on the morning round and being pressed about the steelworks in Scunthorpe. Yeah. It's just not her brief.
Yeah. Where's Jonathan Reynolds?
Yeah. It seems like a really bizarre way to do press access because if we were going to do press properly in this country, if you put someone up to answer questions on the morning round, then they would answer on their brief and on what they're doing in their department.
Yeah. Why do you think that they don't put them forward? Because obviously especially during the Israel and Gaza stuff, they wouldn't put David Lammy forward on the morning rounds. Why do you think that is?
Well, Lammy's a tricky one, isn't he? Because he's been so pro-Palestine for his entire parliamentary career. And then he had to do sort of a way to dial it back to sort of fit the Labour line, didn't he? So he's a little bit of and I suppose he's been a little bit of a loose cannon in terms of what the line that Labour want to keep. Because even there was a correction, wasn't there? I forget the exact.
Oh yeah, there was.
He'd sort of come out and said something, and then
he said something was a war crime,
yes,
and then
he did. Yeah,
they said could be. They corrected it to like could be or should be investigated as. So they softened it.
Correction. Let me have a look. Yeah, Downing Street rejects Lammy's claim that Israel broke international law in Gaza. It's not. He'd said, a spokesperson for the PM said Israel was at risk of breaching humanitarian law, despite Lammy having told the Commons on Monday that the country had definitely done so. That's wild, but that he said it in the Commons and they corrected it.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like that's on Hansard now.
Yeah.
Whether they like it or not.
What did you see when you were in Scunthorpe on Monday?
Well, it's everyone works at the steelworks in Scunthorpe, or has a family member that does, or has a connection, like has some kind of tie to the steelworks. And the town is pretty much it's right next to the steelworks. You can see the cooling. I think it's a cooling tower. Like right, you can see it from the town centre, and it's been there. I'm going to be corrected by steel nonsense, but I think it's been there since late 19th century, because that's when they first discovered that there was. Oh my God, I'm going to be really corrected. Iron ore, no. I think. I'm not sure. Correct me if I'm wrong. Yeah, it's been a part of the town since sort of the late 19th century. And if this steelwork goes, it'll mean that we're the only country in the G7 that doesn't create its own virgin steel, and also the only country in the Commonwealth, which was a phrase you don't hear so often.
But you did hear it from Nigel Farage yesterday on the morning round.
Did he?
Yeah, he was saying that as well, that we'll be the only major economy without, and the only country not in the G7 to not produce steel. And he was going at it from that sort of strategic defence angle, which I guess if you are looking at increasing defence spending as this country is doing, it does seem a bit bizarre to close down your industrial capacity. Which is
what the point actually that the boys who work at the steelworks, a couple of them that I spoke to, and they'll all be in this piece that's going to go out later today. They were saying that it is a national security issue, because if There are more global headwinds. Say there's another illegal invasion of a country. Where are you going to get that steel in from? What if there is, a global trade war? Where are you going to get it in from? And it's the number of things that this virgin steel is used to create is fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's things like Heinz beans. The cans have to be virgin steel. They can't be recycled steel. It's so interesting because you think like, well, so that's going to affect food production.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine if the country can't get its beans.
Oh no.
There's always there's a thing I've sort of been ruminating on for a couple of days now, which is that I wonder if the line on net zero is rather skewed, because the argument for shutting down the blast furnace and creating this recycling steel plant is that they want to reduce carbon emissions. I wonder if it would be, there probably would need to be some sort of global agreement on this, but like if you import steel, any product that you import, mm-hmm. you have to import the carbon that was used to manufacture it mm-hmm. in the first instance.
Yeah.
Because that they'll make an argument that when steel is imported, that it's carbon neutral.
Yeah.
It's not. There's just emissions in a different place.
It does. Yeah. It seems to be like this offshoring of emissions, which you also saw at Port Talbot as well, right? With Tata Steel, that was the argument there as well. And also the refinery in Scotland that's closing is the same thing. The guys are saying, well, you're not reducing our reliance on oil. We're just importing it now from abroad. So you're not at net zero. You're not actually changing how much you consume of the product, which would be the only way to actually make a difference there.
It's greenwashing, isn't it?
It is greenwashing. I wondered, what sort of things did you hear from the men about the potential job losses and the impact that could have on the town?
Well, there's 2,700 jobs that are at risk at this plant out of 3,400, because an electric furnace doesn't need anywhere near the level of staffing that this blast furnace does. But then you've got the sort of the knock-on effect, the domino. So the unions are predicting it would actually lead to around 18,000 people being unemployed or on welfare, because you've got the people who drive the HGVs to get into the plant. You've got the people who work in the cafes outside the plant. You've got the taxi drivers, And there's also been this big push to build new houses. So I spoke to one steel worker who is a bricklayer by trade. He works on bricks inside the steelworks, mm-hmm. but he could, if he were to lose his job, he was like, I could go and build houses. But he's like, but then who would buy a house around here mm-hmm. if there's no work? So that effectively makes his entire profession redundant, or he'd have to move elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. It feels like a story that we've just heard so many times now by this point, like whether it is the refinery, Port Talbot, Redcar, that inside these factories, these are jobs you can get without having gone to university, but they're high-skilled, high-paid jobs. And when these factories close down, there isn't a replacement in the local area. So either you end up receiving welfare, or you end up on a much lower income, which drastically affects your lifestyle and your family's lifestyle. Or you have to move, and that leaves a real brain and skills drain in the town. And it just feels like we've seen this over and over again. And I guess there is a green jobs plan in Scunthorpe, like there was in Grangemouth. And actually I spoke to Charlotte Brumpton Hall from GMB for your piece yesterday, and she was kind of saying the same thing, that Labour are promising green jobs in the area, but the issue is that job losses are coming today, and these green jobs aren't being promised for the next few years. Yeah,
that was the same thing that we saw in Redcar, which was that they built this, they were in construction of this freeport, the Teesside freeport, and there was this pledge. Ben Houchin had opened this freeport, or pledged to open the freeport, and he was saying, this is going to be thousands of jobs for the community. You've seen the death of British steel here. It's just exactly, it's a carbon copy of the of the same story. But the Freeport hasn't been up and ready since the steelworks closed down, which means you've got this really high level of unemployment. And they've sort of tried to turn Redcar into a tourist attraction, but that's seasonal work. Mm-hmm. It's not an industry that you can rely on. Also, if you're going to be a seaside town, you sort of want people in the area to have a well-paid job, which means that they can then on the weekends spend their money in town, but there's no money. Mm-hmm. And that promise, that contract is broken, because Labour aren't a fan of free ports. So even under the Conservatives, that promise was there, which was never fulfilled. It's not going to be fulfilled in the future because Labour did not like them.
Do you think the closure of Scunthorpe is playing out differently to the closure of the steelworks in Port Talbot?
Well, that's so interesting you say that, because I had quite a number of DMs actually late last night from people in Port Talbot who were really furious that nationalisation could be on the table for Scunthorpe because they've all been put out of work and there was no rescue package. And you've got to remember, this was under a Labour government. You know, it was originally the Conservatives who'd signed over this $500 million deal to Tata Steel to keep the blast furnace on. But the deal that Sunak had secured with them was essentially like, well, can you keep it on for a couple more years? By the way, there aren't any conditions. You don't have to keep job security. So by the time Jonathan Reynolds, the business secretary, goes in to negotiate this deal, Tata are like, we actually like the last deal, which was like, you can take the money and you don't have to keep people employed. And instead it's going into that $500 million has to be used to create an electric arc furnace. I think Tata Steel, I think it's around 1.2 billion they have to leverage with that $500 million. But then again, it's sort of like the balances and the checks and balances on this. Who is marking that homework? Who is ensuring that they are spending that money? And how does that benefit the local community? Because it's going to employ about 400 people when it was employing thousands before.
It's interesting because GMB, when I did speak to Charlotte, I asked them, do you feel like you're being listened to by the Labour government? And she had quite a positive opinion of how Labour have taken these negotiations and have gotten everyone around the table and speaking to each other. And she said that they have engaged with unions and Jingye as well very differently to how the Conservative government had engaged with unions during when Port Talbot was closing.
It's interesting, isn't it, that the sort of like, I really don't know where Starmer is going to go with this. I actually, because it was fascinating to see Nigel Farage there and pick up this nationalisation line, because it feels incongruent with reform, with what we know about reform. I was going to say reform policy, but what we expect from reform policy, because they are sort of business tycoons, and they say, they're pro-business tycoons, and their argument would always be, let a business go bust. That's the free market. If they can't make a profit, then tough. The fact that he sort of swooped in, and even in that, I was interviewing him, and he even said, I asked him, would you be pro a government subsidy? Because these are higher paid jobs than, say, if you imported this steel from abroad, workers would be paid less. Would you be on board with a subsidy there? And he said yes. I wonder if that's what sort of moved the dial on where Labour are with nationalisation. We're coming up to local elections. Andrea Jenkins, who's the former Tory, she's running to be the Reform mayor against the Labour mayor. That's in 3 weeks' time. I wonder if Farage has moved the sort of the window of where of conversation, and now Labour might actually give in to nationalisation just because they're worried about the locals.
It's interesting because I think that this is how Nigel has been interacting with Scunthorpe in the nationalisation conversation feels very much to me like this idea that reform can be everything to everyone. And so much of their policy is like hybrid of left-wing and right-wing ideas. And it is kind of like what you're seeing with Trump and the trade protectionism around American industry. But it's even stranger than that, because if you look at like their policy towards water, they're pro like a kind of semi-nationalisation of water as well, which is slightly more left-wing than Labour. And then you have this nationalisation policy towards steel. And then also, even if you look at the rhetoric around reform voters of welfare cuts, there was really interesting polling from Grimsby, and it was JLL Partners, and then they wrote this blog about it. But they were saying that the narrative around welfare cuts coming out of that, when they were polling, was that they were really... people there were so angry about welfare being cut. Like, there wasn't this benefit scrounger rhetoric that we saw in the early 2010s. It was rather, how dare Labour cut this money going to Brits that really deserve it. But at the same time, they believed those welfare cuts were happening because Labour was giving so much money to asylum seekers. So again, you have this really strange hybriding of left-wing and right-wing talking points.
Yeah. they are able, because they're in opposition, to cherry pick the sort of the points that cut through best, the points that poll best with the voters, British voters, and sort of meld together, which is actually, you know, this tracks a reform because they've been doing it for quite some time. Like, do you remember the Richard Tice before Nigel Farage rejoined the party? I'd say it would probably be about a year and a half ago. They came out with this con socialists line. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
But so what they were arguing was that the Conservatives were socialists and they were giving away too much money. The state was too big. But in tandem with that, they were also saying, by the way, when we get in, we're going to offer free bursaries to nurses.
Yeah.
And we're going to raise the threshold from £12,500 personal allowance to £20,000. It's like, you're bang on. They're basically just sort of like doing this hybrid of like left wing and right wing thinking and smashing it together.
Yeah. And I guess probably in its purest form, that is just populism to do that, to just like what is popular.
There you go. That's a clanger, isn't it?
Yeah. And interestingly, I just remembered this, but when you were saying all the stuff that the steelworks in Scunthorpe manufactures, I said this on the podcast yesterday, but on Monday, they manufacture the steel tracks that go inside Caterpillar trucks, which like Caterpillar are the are the American made trucks, and the steel is going to be struck with tariffs.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so I thought that was really interesting.
Oh, wow.
The knock-on effect.
They're doing a lot of National Rail as well, aren't they?
Are they?
At the moment, yeah. God, did you see that story in the, I think it was either the Times or the Telegraph, that civil servants have really fucked up their nationalisation of South Western Railway. So there was a mistake made, which meant that they're going to lease the trains from South Western Rail for the next 5 years for £50 million a year.
Oh my gosh. And
the taxpayer has to foot the bill.
Jeez.
It's so bad.
That is really bad. You'd hate to be that person going into the office today.
Yeah. Did I talk about Port Talbot and about the anger about the nationalisation of it? Yeah. Because there were a number of them who were in the... Oh, no, we went right through it. Never mind. What's next? Sorry. We talked about it. Sorry.
Well, at least British Steel might be being used for the theme park that's going to save the British economy.
Oh, yeah, there is that, isn't there?
Yeah.
Oh, do you know what? That was another thing I was going to say to you. So Farage made this other point about Jingye buying British Steel and then, you know, using that name, co-opting the name, and then closing it down. He was like, the Chinese Communist Party are going to be laughing about this all the way, you know, because you've essentially taken one of the sort of Britain's big industrial powers and closed it down. I thought that was so interesting because it's sort of like, it reminded me of the sort of conversations we were having under the Conservatives, where, do you remember, it was like sort of Bob Seeley and I think it was Tobias Ellwood and Tom Tugendhat who launched an attack on using Huawei infrastructure in the UK. I was interested because I was trying to think, well, you put up such a stink about using this hardware because you said that it was it was pretty much access for the Chinese government to be able to spy if they were, you know, you don't know how they're putting this hardware together. Why did you let Jingye buy British Steel? Why did you let that merger happen? Because that would have gone through the business department. You know, when you're doing a takeover bid that large, it does go through government. I wonder if it would have even have gone through sort of the monopolies. Would it be a monopoly? I don't know.
It's interesting as well because it's not just steel, and it does make you sound like an absolute China hawk when you start to talk like this. But Grangemouth as well is owned by Petra Ineos, which is one part PetroChina, which is the partially state-owned oil company in China as well. So it is interesting just how big a foothold China has in Britain's industrial capacity, and now in the decline of its industrial capacity as well.
But absolutely. But even with Tata Steel, which is an Indian company, you know, you sort of say, why is there so much foreign ownership? But this is making me sound like I'm a real skeptic, or like, you know, like it's sort of like I'm being sort of like small-brained here. But it is interesting that you would allow these sort of huge foreign companies to take over some of your largest infrastructure projects, because they are subsidized so heavily by the taxpayer. And so you're subsidizing foreign profits. That's not even going to go through, the tax on that will not even go through the exchequer. And then when those private companies decide that actually it's not profitable enough for them, then they pull out. Well, you've got an extra cost now onto the taxpayer because they now have to foot the welfare bill for all of these people. You know, like when we're looking at sort of redundancy packages, the sort of redundancy package that was put together for Tata Steel or what the unions were negotiating, you know, that is in part funded by the taxpayer. It's extraordinary.
It does make you question just what was the rationale between for privatizing these companies in the first place? Because I think it's really hard for any politician or any consumer, like whether that's water or whether that's in other industries, to name a benefit they've received from privatization because it's not been lower bills. So what is it?
Do you know, I met don't know why that suddenly just reminded me, but I met a really interesting steelworker. He was on a mobility scooter going through the town, and I said, "Oh, hello, can I speak to you about the steelworks?" And he was so sweet. He was like, "I've been waiting for someone to ask me." And I was like, great. And he worked there for years, but he was signed off work in 2010 because he's lost the ability to walk. The job is so dangerous, and he was inhaling so many fumes. He's basically got like 50 different ailments.
Oh my gosh.
And he's unable to walk. And I was like, well, do you think it's safe to work in the steelworks then? What do you think? You know, do you think it should still be open? He was like, absolutely. Like it's the lifeblood and like it should be nationalised. Yeah.
And I wonder how someone like he or him feels about the Labour government, seeing that if they don't step in and nationalise the steelworks, and then someone on long-term disability who's facing welfare cuts from Labour at the same time.
Well, he was. That's what he said.
Really?
He said that his PIP payments were, you know, he wasn't sure. He had to go for a reassessment.
How would that make him? Because that would have, people in Scunthorpe would have once been Labour's core voter base.
Oh, yeah.
And are they now? Like, it makes sense why Nigel Farage is there and drumming up so much support.
I also spoke to Sir Nick Dakin, who is the Labour MP there, and he has been the Labour MP there for, I think, since 2010. He was so clued up on it, and you could tell there was sort of like it'll be in the piece if you want to go and listen to it, but not you, that was for the audience. That's so rude, isn't it? If you want to go and listen to it. He was sort of like, you could tell he was being restrained. He wants nationalisation, but he's having to act within the constraints. He's a justice minister, within the correct constraints of the government, because it's such a no-brainer Labour policy.
Yeah.
If they were still in opposition, they would be calling for it. It should be a product of the people.
Yeah, but it's interesting how and obviously because he's a minister, it's different for him, but how we have seen previously Labour MPs in these towns that are really ravished by deindustrialisation step out of line with the Labour Party to speak up for their constituents. Like Brian Leishman in Grangemouth has been severely out of line with Labour's stance on the closing of the refinery, and has repeatedly and ran his whole election on the need for it to be nationalised, and has constantly spoken in Parliament about the need for it to be nationalised.
He's lucky he didn't get deselected.
Yeah, interesting choice. Choice
he must have been locked in or something from like years ago.
He had, I think Grangemouth was quite an SNP seat, so maybe they weren't super confident that he would win in that seat. I'm not sure.
I wonder if they gave him a lot of campaign money. That would be an interesting FOI, wouldn't it? To find out if they actually spent a lot of money in that area campaigning, or if they were like, you can just lose the seat, we can sacrifice it.
Yeah, because he did run like almost his entire campaign on nationalising the steelworks and the need to help the workers.
Jeez. I feel like we should probably wrap up there because football want to get in, don't they? When I was in Scunthorpe, I didn't manage to speak to Roj Rahman, who is one of the directors at Scunthorpe Football Club, which is called the Irons, by the way.
Oh, wow.
You know, steel. And is that the same thing?
Yes.
I'm joking. Anyway, but he did text me last night, and he sent me over a voice note because I wanted to include him because the football club have been offering discounted or free tickets to British steelworkers.
Wow.
And they're also like facilitating, they're letting people use the area if they want to do rallies, or if they want to, you know, like they're working with the unions. And anyway, so he sent me a little voice note about his the work that he's been doing, and this is him.
What we've done is we've given discounted tickets as soon as we heard of the plight. It's our way of showing solidarity. It's our way of showing our support and our commitment to our town, to our steelworks, to our fans. And we're hopefully going to do this with the next home game coming up. And God forbid, if if for some reason the works, the steel from the steel works, the jobs have gone, we promised as a club to do whatever we can to support the staff in which other way possible. Obviously, we want them still to come to the games. We'll look at maybe to provide match day tickets at discounted prices. Look at special events for the affected workers and their families to boost morale. Maybe we could look at, setting up job fairs at the stadiums and partner with local businesses to try and reskill the current workforce there. And maybe even look to see if there's any temporary work that we can provide, match day stewardship, etc. We are fully committed as a club to ensure that those affected at the Scunthorpe Steelworks, that we will give them our 100% support. They've given us 100% support by supporting us at our time of need and coming to the games on a regular basis over the last 125 years. So as a club, we promise that we will do whatever we can within our powers to support the steel workers and help them in their hour of need. We are committed to doing this. Thank you.
Is there anything else that we've missed?
I don't think so.
Well, they can watch the piece if they fancy. One thing I wanted to talk about. The other night, it was quite late, and I was on TikTok, and I was just scrolling through, and then I just so happened to when you get a random TikTok live, there was this Iannucci and Amanda Iannucci and Helen Lewis, the podcast about, and I was just so interested in it, and I clicked on it, and it was a bunch of I think they were school kids or uni kids, and they were just chatting politics with each other.
Oh wow.
And then I did the most millennial thing, which was I forgot that they could see that I joined.
No.
And then they were like, why is she here? And I was like, oh my God. And I was they were and then I realized they're the people who make all the Blair and Brown fan cams. Yes.
I love them.
I know. I was I love the fan cams. Yeah.
Oh, did you say that? Did you comment that?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
And then when I went in, they were bitching about Ed Balls. And so I was if I could have done this incognito, I would have stayed. I would have just stayed and kept listening.
So they're not the ones making the political currency fan cams then?
No. Oh no, I think they are. But they were, they're just I don't think, they kind of seemed quite brown heads.
Yes,
do you know what I mean?
those fan cams are very pro Gordon Brown. Yeah, as they should be. But
yeah, Brown. I think that's my dream interview.
Those kids or Gordon Brown?
Gordon Brown. We went to a food bank. You were there, weren't you? Do you remember? And do you remember I went and asked him for an interview, and then he held my hand and was I'm sorry, my dear, I can't do it today. And I just froze. I was like, no worries.
Have you washed your hands since?
No. Cool. All right.
Thank you.
See you on the Reddit.
Bye.